blunt arithmetic of power collided on the global stage this week as Iran's parliamentary speaker and other senior officials pushed a narrative that the United States may have already exhausted its most immediate levers for calming energy markets, while Tehran still retains options that, if used, could reverberate through global supply lines and political calendars. At the center of the messaging was Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament, who took to social media to push a carefully calibrated argument. Washington has drawn from its strategic reserves and exerted demand-side pressure, but Iran's control of choke points and certain pipeline corridors amounts to major unplayed cards that remain in its hand. The post, short on operational detail but long on implication, was read by markets and diplomats as a reminder that geography can be itself a form of leverage. Ghalibaf's comments singled out three familiar, tightly constrained arteries of world energy flows: the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab al-Mandab, and overland pipeline corridors that move crude across the region. By naming those routes, his message was not a tactical blueprint but a political framing. He sought to shift the conversation away from an abstract duel of wills and toward a more tangible calculus: who actually controls the physical routes through which oil moves, and therefore who truly holds the capacity to change supply, quickly and painfully. Markets reacted, as markets do, to both rhetoric and real actions. In the immediate hours after the statements and a string of maritime incidents near Iran's waters, benchmark prices rose sharply. Brent crude climbed into the mid to high 90s per barrel, while US SR fixed West Texas Intermediate approached the high 80s to low 90s, levels that push up refined fuel costs at the pump and feed straight into the political calculations of governments sensitive to consumer pain. Traders and analysts noted that he moves were propelled as much by fear and positioning as by measured assessments of how many barrels might actually be taken offline. Ghalibaf's line of argument leaned on two linked claims. On the US side, he suggested that the most visible American tools have already been deployed: strategic petroleum reserve releases, public appeals to conserve or shift demand, and coercive financial instruments. On Iran's side, he argued that a number of geographically conditioned options have not yet been exercised, and that invoking them, even colloquially, forces opponents to weigh the domestic cost of higher fuel prices alongside any wider geopolitical objectives. That explicit politicization of energy, linking fuel prices at home to foreign policy choices abroad, is not new, but the timing is notable. Ghalibaf referenced the coming summer fuel season in the Northern Hemisphere, an annual cyclical pressure point in which household demand for gasoline typically rises. The suggestion was that any upward shock to crude prices in those months would produce immediate domestic headaches for US leaders. Headaches that can influence politics as quickly as they do balance sheets. The rhetoric around choke points is more than theatre. The Strait of Hormuz alone remains one of the world's most consequential maritime corridors. A narrow ribbon of water where a few dozen tankers can represent millions of barrels of crude transiting monthly. The Bab al-Mandab at the entrance to the Red Sea is smaller in volume but strategically vital, connecting Middle Eastern producers with Europe and the Atlantic. And pipelines, linear, fixed, and often politically contested, can be sabotaged, redirected, or kept offline through legal and irregular means. By drawing attention to all three, Iran's leadership sought to widen the frame. It is not just Hormuz, they intimated, and it is not just missiles or mines. The geography of hydrocarbons is larger and more brittle than a single headline sue. Jests, Iran's messaging was echoed by a senior official in the executive branch who pushed the argument in explicitly economic terms. Mohammad Reza Aref, Iran's first vice president, warned that global price stability would require an end to restrictions on Iranian oil. Paraphrasing that line into its simplest claim: if you want steady markets, let Iranian supply play its part. That argument blends a normative claim that markets should be open and fair with a pragmatic bargaining chip. It turns the issue of sanctions and trade restrictions into not only a matter of politics or punishment, but into a technical lever that, if adjusted, can immediately alter market balances. The broader scene is one in which regional maritime incidents have risen in both frequency and intensity. Over the past weeks, there have been reported seizures, interdictions, and the occasional use of force around the Gulf of Oman, the Strait of Hormuz, and adjacent waters. US naval forces have reported on four. Sing a containment line, Iran's security services have accused the US of unlawful seizures and interventions. In one recent episode, a US vessel intercepted an Iranian flagged ship in the Gulf of Oman, an action that President Donald J. Trump publicly described as defensive and justified, and that Iranian authorities condemned as illegal, an exchange typical of the tit-for-tat escalation that now shapes maritime transit. Energy specialists watching tanker routes say that even limited disruptions can produce outsized market reactions when confidence is weak. That is because oil pricing, in moments of heightened geopolitical risk, is less a pure measure of barrels in the ground and more a reading of perceived future scarcity. That phenomenon, where sentiment drives price more than immediate fundamentals, has a name in trading rooms. It is sometimes called vibe trading. Market psychologists argue that when traders price in the risk of escalation, they bid up futures ahead of any confirmed supply loss, and that speculative premium then ripples through to spot prices and refined products. Ghalibaf explicitly played to that market psychology. Without laying out military options or declaring intent, his posts and comments were meant to shape perceptions. If Iran is seen as able to affect key routes, then the market will price that contingency whether or not Iran moves. The logic is simple and measured. Control the narrative and you can influence the price. Beyond Tehran, the conversation spilled into the Kremlin. Russia's leader offered a long, sweeping critique of what he described as Western conduct on the international stage, linking it directly to control over energy and resource flows. He framed diplomacy as an art, sharp but performative, and chastised what he cast as European and American hypocrisy. In the course of that address, he advanced a blunt assertion about motives. Vladimir Putin said our American colleagues no longer conceal that. This is fundamentally about oil. Their doctrine is to dominate the global energy markets. He underscored the competitive, even zero-sum frame that has been animating parts of the international system. Resource control, he argued, is not incidental to power, it is power's currency. Putin's language traced decades of strategic competition into the present standoff, reminding listeners that pipelines, sanctions, and political pressure are central instruments in a broader battle over access and influence. He also offered a prescription for what diplomacy should and should not demand of partners. In a passage that mixed moral language with a rhetorical jibe at European policymakers, he argued that calls for Russia to clarify its red lines were improper. He framed such calls as presumptuous and even dismissive of sovereign dignity. Vladimir Putin said it's, a form of racism to some extent, implying a dismissive attitude towards a partner, in this case, the Russian Federation, because to say they need to clarify our red lines, well, that's ridiculous. They were designated long ago. In the same speech, he returned to a more human, almost aphoristic register, borrowing a joke he used to make a point about the performative nature of negotiation. Vladimir Putin said, "Diplomacy is the art of telling someone where to go, but doing it in such a way that they actually look forward to the trip." That line, part joke, part critique, was deployed to argue that effective diplomacy combines firmness with a sense of craft. He wrapped that point into a broader defense of uncompromising interests, insisting that any compromising must not infringe core security concerns. The tone reinforced a central theme of the moment as global powers posture the vocabulary of red lines, strategic reserves, and choke points becomes the lingua franca of coercion. The practical consequence of these overlapping narratives, Tehran's a reminder of geographic leverage, Washington's public use of its reserve and naval power, and Moscow's ideological framing is an energy market that is more volatile and politically charged than it might appear in calmer times. Traders take cues from official statements and incidents at sea, just as much as from inventories and refinery turnarounds. When officials talk about unplayed cards, the market discounts the value of those options in real time. For Washington, the calculus is doubly complex. The administration has signaled that it is prepared to use reserves, to engage in maritime interdictions, and to pursue a mix of sanctions and enforcement actions aimed at constraining revenues to Tehran. But those are finite tools. Strategic petroleum reserve releases can blunt a short-term price spike. They do not, by themselves, change the structural rigidity of global spare capacity or the political will of producers elsewhere. Naval interdictions can slow shipments and punish individual actors, but they also risk escalating into tit-for tat responses that further complicate transit security. For Tehran, the messaging achieves several goals simultaneously. That telegraphs that Iran is not powerless. It ratchets up potential political costs for adversaries, and it signals to domestic and allied audiences that the country retains strategic depth. All of those messages matter at a time when internal pressures, economic sanctions, and regional theatre are tightly interconnected. What does this mean for consumers and policymakers? First, expect a political feedback loop. Rising crude prices feed into higher pump prices, which translate into domestic voter discontent in consumer economies. That, in turn, constrains policymakers who might otherwise opt for more aggressive foreign postures. Second, supply-side fixes take time. Bringing new barrels to market requires production increases, shipping capacity, and often the cooperation of other producing states, none of which can be conjured instantly. Third, the psychological P. Premium attached to possible disruptions can persist even if no physical supply is removed. Fear begets hedging, hedging begets premiums, premiums push prices up. Analysts who watch the regions stress that the most dangerous phase is not a single incident but a pattern. Incremental escalations that narrow the margin for de-escalations. In such a climate, miscalculation is more likely because actors must make choices under compressed time horizons and with outsized domestic incentives. A naval interception, a mine, a sanctioned tanker, reflagged and sent back on a different course. Each can be both a discrete event and a signal in an evolving strategic conversation. The final element of the story is diplomatic. Can the energy question be disentangled from broader disputes? Iran's vice president and other officials made it plain that for Tehran, sanctions and military pressure are not separable from market stability. Their argument is a transactional one: lift restrictions and price roller. Volatility eases, maintain pressure, and the risk premium persists. Whether Western governments accept that framing as the basis for negotiation is a political question as much as an economic one. A clear paradox lies at the heart of the moment. Energy markets are valuable tools for influence because they are immediately felt by ordinary people, yet the very immediacy of those effects creates an incentive for leaders to avoid escalation, or in some cases to weaponize it. That contradiction means every public statement, every maritime move, and every official social media post carries weight well beyond its literal content. The week's messaging from Tehran and Moscow was a reminder that in a world where crude continues to be the lifeblood of many national economies, control over routes and the ability to influence sentiment can be as consequential as a change in production numbers. Policymakers who hope to shift outcomes quickly will find the levers are fewer and the trade-offs starker than they may appear in a headline. As the northern summer approaches and the driving season begins, the pressure points will sharpen. Markets will watch for any physical disruption, but they will perhaps watch more closely for the next sentence, the next post, the next ship, interdicted far from shore, signals that can turn a narrow crisis into an extended risk premium on global energy. For now, the argument is being fought not only by naval commanders and energy ministers, but by those who can shape perception, legislators who write tweets, presidents who comment in briefings, and leaders who deliver long monologues that thread history, grievance and strategy into a single public claim. Whether the standoff resolves through negotiation, silent management of supply, or an unfortunate spiral remains to be seen. What is clear is that the age of cheap narrative is over. In this contest, words are themselves instruments of power, and their effect on the pump, on the balance sheet, and in elections is immediate. The interplay of geography and politics has returned as the decisive margin in energy, and the cards those actors hold may yet decide how hot this summer becomes.